I. My Aunt Dolores died on a Tuesday in October of 1994, down in Charlotte, of something that had been coming for a year and a half, and my mother had been half-packed for 2 months waiting on the phone call. When it came, she and my father left the next morning at 6. The funeral was Thursday, and there was an estate to start sorting through, so they'd be gone until Sunday. 4 days. I was 17, a senior at Allegheny High. I had a job Friday and Saturday nights bagging at the grocery in Sparta, and I had a truck, and I had every reason in the world to argue against going with them. I don't think my mother wanted to fight it. She was gutted, and she had 100 things on her mind, and I was 6 months from graduating. She stood in the kitchen with her coat on and gave me the whole list. Call the Sheltons if anything happens. I don't run the wood stove down to nothing. Feed the dog, lock up. And then she hugged me too long and got in the car. Our house sat at the top of a dirt road about 7 miles out of Sparta. Up on the Allegheny Plateau where the land goes flat and high before it falls off into the gorge. It was a white 2-story farmhouse my great-grandfather put up, with a wraparound porch, a wood stove in the front room, a propane tank out by the fence, and a mercury vapor yard light on a pole between the house and the barn that came on by itself at dusk and burned all night. 14 acres, it's mostly pasture we didn't run anything on anymore. Closest neighbor was the Shelton place, 1.25 miles down the hill and out of sight around the shoulder of the ridge. In October at night with the leaves off, you could stand in our driveway and not see a single artificial light in any direction except our own. I want to say plainly that I was not afraid of that. I'd grown up there. That kind of dark is just what dark looks like where I'm from, and the dogs and the wind and the barn settling were the sounds of a normal night. I had been left alone before for an evening or a day. 4 days felt like a gift. Wednesday night was nothing. I'll say that too, because the way I've come to think about it, Wednesday night is when it started, and I just didn't have anything to notice it with yet. I made a frozen pizza and watched TV until 11 and went to bed. Our dog was a black and tan hound mix named Pete. My father named her Pete when he thought she was a male puppy and never changed it. And she slept under the front porch in a nest of hay in the cold months. I let her out and she went under, and that was Wednesday. Thursday I went to school. I came home about 4, did chores, ate, and it got dark around 6:40. And around 7 I looked out the kitchen window over the sink. The way you do, and the yard was black. The yard light was out. Now, that light had been out before. It was a mercury vapor unit that had been up there since the 70s, and my father had changed the bulb twice that I knew of. What was different was that the fixture wasn't dark the way a burned-out fixture is dark. A dying mercury bulb flickers and cycles for weeks before it quits, comes on orange, goes out, tries again. And this one had been fine the night before and fine the night before that. So I went out with a flashlight and looked up at it. The pole was a treated 4x4 set in concrete. And the fixture head was at about 10 feet with the photocell on the side of it. And I stood there and put my light on it, and I could see, plain as anything, that the glass housing had been swung open on its hinge and left hanging. And the bulb inside was sitting cockeye set in the socket. Somebody had unscrewed it. A half turn, maybe less, just far enough to break contact. I stood in that yard for a long time. I remember the feel of the cold coming through my shirt and the sound of the wind in the poplars along the fence, and Pete somewhere behind me on the porch, not making any noise at all. We did not own a ladder that would reach 10 feet. We had a 6-foot step ladder in the barn, and a wooden extension ladder my father had loaned to my uncle in August and never gotten back. I checked the barn that night because I had to know, and the stepladder was hanging on its nails where it lived, dusty, not moved. I want to explain what I did next, because I've had 30 years to be honest with myself about it. I did not call the Sheltons. I did not call the sheriff's department. I did not call my parents at my aunt's house in Charlotte, where the number was written on the pad by the phone in my mother's handwriting. Because I was 17. Because my father had left me in charge of a house and 14 acres and a dog, and because in my mind the only thing worse than something being wrong was being the boy who called his mama at a funeral because a light bulb was loose. I told myself somebody had come up the road and messed with it. Kids. Somebody from school, one of the Blevins boys who did stuff like that. That was a real possibility, and I let it be the whole possibility. I got the stepladder out, set it under the pole. I stood on the top step, which you're not supposed to do, and I could just get my fingertips on the bulb. I turned it in until it seated, and the light hummed and came on, and I went back inside feeling like I'd handled something. Friday I worked until 9. I came home and everything was fine. The yard light was burning. Pete came out for her food. Saturday I worked the day shift, 10 to 6. I got home a little after 6:30 with a hamburger from the Hardee's in town, and the yard was black again. Same thing. Housing swung open. Bulb backed out a half turn. That was the moment the floor went out from under me. And it wasn't fear exactly, not yet. It was more like the world quietly rearranging itself. Because a prank happens once. A prank is somebody driving by. But when a thing gets undone the same way twice, 3 days apart, by somebody who has to bring a ladder up a mile of dirt road to do it, it is not a prank. It is a person with a reason. I didn't fix it that time. I don't know why. Maybe I understood by then that fixing it just told them I'd noticed. I went in and I locked the front door, the back door, the kitchen door onto the side porch. And the door in the basement that came up out of the walkout. 4 exterior doors, which was 3 more than any house needs. And I turned every deadbolt and I hooked the chain on the front. Then I made myself eat the hamburger standing at the counter with the light off, looking out the window at nothing. It got full dark by 7. I sat in the front room with the TV on low and the wood stove ticking, and I did not feel right. And around 9:30 I turned the TV off because I needed to hear. The propane tank started at maybe 5 after 10. Our tank was a 500-gallon horizontal, painted silver sitting on 2 concrete blocks about 40 feet off the side porch by the fence. It was mostly full that time of year, and a steel tank that size, mostly full, makes a very particular noise when weight comes against it. A slow, deep, metallic tick, the sound of the shell flexing a hair against the saddle, and then another one when the weight shifts back. It's not a loud sound. If the television had been on, I would never have heard it. A kick. Long pause. Tick. I knew that sound because I'd made it myself 100 times as a kid, leaning on that tank, waiting on my father to finish something in the barn. It is the sound of a person standing against it, resting, shifting from one foot to the other. It went on for 20 minutes. I sat on the arm of the couch in the dark. 12 feet from a window I could not make myself walk past. I listened to a person lean on my family's propane tank for 20 minutes. And then it stopped. And about a minute after it stopped, Pete started. I have had dogs my whole life. I know every noise they make. This was not one of them. It was not a bark, and it was not a growl, and it was not the yipping a dog does at a coyote. It was a low, continuous, unbroken whine. Coming up through the floorboards from under the porch directly beneath me, a sound with no breath breaks in it, going on and on and on. And I could hear her moving. She had backed herself into the far corner of the lattice. Up against the foundation stones, and she was pressed there flat, and she was not coming out. That dog would go into a groundhog hole. That dog treed a bear once. And she was under my house, making a sound like something with its leg in a trap, because something was in the yard she would not look at. I got my father's shotgun out of the closet in their bedroom. It was a Remington 870, 12 gauge, and the shells were in a coffee can on the shelf above it, and my hands were shaking so bad. It took me 3 tries to get 4 of them in the tube. Then I sat down on the floor in the upstairs hallway with my back against the wall. I picked that hallway because it was the only place in that house with no window in it. Bedroom doors on both sides, bathroom at the end. Stairs going down at my left, and nothing but plaster and wallpaper around me. I sat there with that shotgun across my knees, and I did not turn on one single light for the rest of the night. Because I understood, and I don't know how a 17-year-old understands this, but I did, that a lit window in a black house is a stage, and I was not going to be on it. Pete whined until about 11:30. Then she stopped. And the stopping was worse. I heard the porch boards. Twice, maybe 3 times, in the small hours. That particular groan the third board from the steps made, which I could have picked out of 100 sounds, because I'd been stepping over it my whole life. I heard something along the side of the house, down where the basement door was. Once, near 2, I heard the storm door on the kitchen side open, that aluminum whump and hiss it makes on the closer, and then close again slow, all the way gentle, the way you close a door when you don't want it to bang. I did not move. I want to be clear about that. I sat in that hallway for 9 hours, and I did not go to a window, and I did not go down the stairs, and I did not call out. And part of me has always been ashamed of that, and the older part of me knows it's the only reason I'm here to tell it. The light started coming gray around 6:40. I waited until it was full daylight, maybe 7:15. And then I stood up on legs that had gone dead under me, and I went down the stairs with that gun. All 4 doors were standing open. Front door, back door, side porch door, basement door. Wide open, not ajar. Not unlatched. Swung fully back on their hinges and standing there, the way my mother would leave them on the first warm Saturday in April to air the house out. The chain on the front door was hanging loose. The deadbolts had all been turned from the inside. There was cold October morning light lying in 4 rectangles on the floors, and the house was 51 degrees, and the wood stove was dead out. Nothing was taken. I checked everything. My mother's jewelry box, my father's other guns, the coffee can with money in it in the kitchen cabinet, the TV, the truck keys on the hook. Nothing was gone, nothing was moved. There wasn't a muddy print or a scuff or a single thing out of place in that entire house, except that every way in or out of it was standing open. Pete came out from under the porch when I called her, and she ate her food, and she was fine, and she lived another 6 years, and she never went under that porch again as long as she lived. She slept in the barn from that morning on, and my father could never figure out why. I closed the doors. I locked them. I fixed the yard light with the stepladder. I got the wood stove going, and I ran the heat all day, and by the time my parents pulled in Sunday afternoon, that house was 74 degrees, and I had done the dishes and mowed the last of the yard. My mother asked how it went. I said fine. On Monday, my father noticed the stepladder was in the yard instead of the barn, and I told him the yard light had come loose, and the wind must have gotten the doors Saturday night because I'd left the back one unlatched. He said, well, be careful, and that was the last anybody in my family ever spoke of it. I have wondered 100,000 times what it wanted. That's the part that never settles. If it was a thief, there was money in the cabinet. If it was somebody who meant me harm, it had 9 hours and 4 unlocked doors and a boy sitting on a hallway floor who would not have been hard to find. It came in. It walked through the house I was in, and then it opened every door in that house and left, and I have never been able to decide whether that was somebody showing me they could, or somebody who honestly did not know that isn't what you do when you leave a house. I'm 48 now. I live outside Winston-Salem in a neighborhood with streetlights on both ends, and I have not spent a night on that plateau in 20 years. My wife thinks it's a joke, the thing I do. Every night before bed, I check the front door, and the back, and the door to the garage, and then I go back and check all 3 again, and then I lie down. She'll say from the bed, you already did it, and I'll say I know, and I'll say goodnight. I've never told her why. I've never told anybody the part that keeps me up, which isn't the tank or the dog or the doors. It's that I went and unscrewed that yard light myself, once, years later, out of curiosity. Standing on a ladder in my own driveway with the fixture in my hands. You have to reach up into it. You have to hold the housing open with one hand and turn the bulb with the other, and it's hot, and you have to be steady. And it takes both hands in about 15 seconds. Whoever it was stood 10 feet in the air in my yard, in the dark, with both hands over their head, 15 seconds at a time, twice, while I was inside. We bought that farmhouse outside Fancy Gap in the fall of 1998, the year I turned 24. Because it was 11 acres and $41,000, and my husband Danny drove for a carrier out of Mount Airy and said he could do the work on it himself in the winters. It sat up on the crest of the Blue Ridge about 4 miles off the parkway, on a gravel road that ran along the top of the ridge with the land falling away hard on the east side toward the Piedmont. In summer, you could stand in that yard and see 40 miles. In February, you couldn't see the fence. It was a 1920s house. 2 stories, tin roof, no insulation to speak of. A kitchen that had been added on the north side in about 1950 and never got a proper foundation under it. There was a wood stove in the front room and baseboard electric upstairs that we couldn't afford to run. The well was drilled in 1974, and the pump sat down in a block pit at the edge of the yard, 30 feet from the kitchen, with a plywood lid and a piece of tin over that and a rock on top of the tin. Danny left out Tuesday mornings, usually before 5, and he ran a lane down to Charlotte and over to Knoxville and back, and he was home Friday evenings, 4 nights a week. So it was me and Ren, our daughter, who was 11 months old that February, and just starting to pull up on the furniture. I want to say what that kind of alone is like, because people who haven't done it hear alone and think of an empty apartment. Our nearest neighbor was a man named Coy Hazelwood, 70-some, half a mile north, and he went to bed at 8 o'clock. There was nobody south of us for 2 miles. The road wasn't plowed in winter until the county got around to it, and it froze in ruts, and there were weeks when I did not drive off that ridge at all. The phone was on a line that ran through a mile of trees, and it went down in the first ice storm in January, and Verizon told me 11 to 14 days, and then 12 days later told me 11 to 14 days. And by February, I had stopped calling because I had to drive to the Exxon at the interchange to call, and it was 5 miles each way with a baby. I had a radio. I had a wood stove. I had a 19-year-old Ford with a bad heater. That was February for us, and I knew the sounds of that house the way you know the inside of your own mouth. That's the whole of what I'm about to tell you. 4 nights a week for 2 years, alone in a house you can hear every board of. You learn it. You learn the way the tin ticks when the sun comes off it. You learn which step creaks and how the wind sounds different out of the north than out of the west. And you learn the pump. The pump was a half-horse jet pump in that pit, and when it kicked on, you could hear it in the whole house. Not loud. A low mechanical thrum coming up through the kitchen floor with a little rattle in it. And it ran for as long as water was moving, and then it shut off with a clunk when the pressure tank came back up. Wash your hands, the pump runs 8 seconds. Fill the bathtub, it runs 4 minutes. Flush the toilet, it kicks on for 20. If you have lived with a well, you know exactly what I mean. That sound is a sentence. Somebody is using water. The night was the 11th of February, 1999, a Wednesday. And it was 19 degrees with a wind and no snow on the ground, just that hard blue-gray frozen bare that the ridge gets. Ren had been down since 8. I'd fallen asleep on top of the quilt in my clothes with the bedroom door open, and I woke up at 2:40 in the morning by the clock radio on the floor, and I woke up because the pump was running. I lay there with my eyes open, and I did what everybody does, which is go around the house in your head. The kitchen tap was off. I'd washed the bottles at 10. The bathroom was off. The washer was off. The toilet, if it had been running, makes a different sound. It fills and then it trails off, and you can hear the fill valve. There was no fixture in that house asking for water, and the pump was running. And it ran a long time. 9 minutes. I know because I lay there and watched that clock radio go from 2:40 to 2:49. And I did not blink much, then it stopped. I got up. I went through the hole downstairs in the dark, in my sock feet, and put my hand on the kitchen faucet and the bathroom faucet, and I got down and looked under both sinks for a wet spot with a flashlight. I. Because the reasonable explanation is a leak. A line let go somewhere and the pump is trying to keep pressure. That's what a leak does. But a leak that runs the pump 9 minutes is a leak that puts water on the floor. I. And there was not one drop anywhere in that house. Everything was dry. Everything was still. I was standing in the middle of the kitchen with the flashlight off when it started again, 10 minutes after it had stopped. 2:59. The floor started to hum under my feet, and I stood there in that dark kitchen, and I understood what I was hearing. And I have never before or since felt anything move through my body like that. There was a frost-free spigot on the outside of the north kitchen wall. Danny had put it in the summer before so we could water the garden without dragging hose around the house. And it stuck out of the siding about 8 feet from where I was standing, with nothing between me and it but 3/4-inch board and a course of siding. Somebody was out there using it. That was the only thing in the world it could be. There was no other draw on that system. Somebody was standing on the north side of my house in 19-degree weather at 3 o'clock in the morning. Turning the handle on my spigot, filling something, letting it stop, and doing it again. It ran 7 minutes that time. I want to explain what I did next in the right order. Because when I tell this, people always ask why I didn't do something else, and there wasn't anything else. There was no phone. There was no neighbor I could reach without going out the door and putting a baby in a cold truck in the dark with somebody standing in my yard. Danny was in Tennessee or Georgia, and there was no way on God's earth to reach him. Coy Hazelwood was 72 years old and half a mile away and deaf in one ear. So I went upstairs and I got Wren out of her crib without turning on a light. And she woke up and started to fuss, and I got her against my shoulder and got her quiet. And I carried her into the bathroom and I put her in the bathtub with 2 blankets under her and one over. I picked that bathroom because it was the only room in that house without a window. It was interior off the hall, a room somebody had carved out of a bedroom in 1953, 4 walls and a door and no glass in any of them. And I sat down in the open doorway on the floor with my back against the jamb, where I could see down the length of the hall to the top of the stairs, and I had a kitchen knife in my right hand, a boning knife with a wood handle, the one I used on chicken. And I knew perfectly well, sitting there, that I would not be able to use it. I knew that about myself. I was 130 pounds, and I had never hit anybody in my life, and there is a kind of clarity that comes at 3 in the morning, where you stop lying to yourself about what you do. The pump ran 4 more times that night. 3:14, 3:31, 3:52, 4:20. Between times, the house was so quiet I could hear the wood stove settling downstairs and the wind coming across the tin and Wren breathing in the tub. And I sat in that doorway and listened to a machine under my kitchen floor tell me over and over that somebody was still out there. The last one was 4:20 and it ran the longest, 11 minutes, then nothing. The clock went to 5 and to 5:30, and the sky in the hall window at the end went from black to a kind of iron color, and I did not move off that floor until it was light enough to see the fence line. Wren slept through the whole thing. She woke up at 7 in the bathtub and thought it was the funniest thing that had ever happened to her. I put her on my hip and I got Danny's .22 out of the closet, which I could load and which I had shot at cans, and I went out the front door and around the west side and came around the north corner of the house. The ground around that spigot was destroyed. There was a patch maybe 6 feet across where the grass was gone and the clay had been churned into mud and then frozen solid overnight, and the mud had frozen with everything still in it. Boot prints. Layers of them, on top of each other, pressed into each other, some of them deep and some faint, going every direction. The way the ground looks at a gate where cattle stand and wait. You could not have counted them. Nobody could have. And the frozen mud was hard as concrete under my hand, which meant the churning had happened when it was wet, which meant it had been happening on nights when the ground thawed, which meant weeks, months maybe. There was ice under the spigot in a spread-out lens, and a piece of blue baling twine on the ground, and a dark ring on the frozen mud about 8 inches across, where something round had been set down over and over. And leading away from that spot, going north-northeast across our pasture toward the tree line, where the ridge dropped off toward Chance's Creek, there was a path. Not a deer trail. Deer trails wander and cross and split. This was one line, going straight, worn into the dead winter grass down to bare ground, about a foot wide. And it went 400 feet across open pasture and into the woods. And I stood there with my baby on my hip, and my husband's rifle in my hand, and I did not take one single step toward it. I put Ren in the truck, and I drove to the Exxon at the interchange and called the sheriff's department in Hillsville, and a deputy came out about 11 o'clock. He was decent. He walked the pasture with me. He looked at the mud and he said, "Somebody's been getting water," in a flat voice like a man reading a gauge, and I said yes, and I said, "For how long?" And he pushed at the frozen ground with his boot and looked out at that tree line for a while and said, "A good while." He said there was a lot of empty country back in there. He said people camped where they weren't supposed to. He said he'd have somebody run the road at night when they could. He wrote a report and gave me a case number on a card, and I kept that card in my wallet for 11 years. Nobody ever came back with an answer. Nobody was ever caught. Danny got home Friday, and I told him, and he was sick about it. And Saturday he pulled that spigot out of the wall and capped the line inside and put a piece of siding over the hole. And Sunday he drove to Galax and bought a padlock and a length of chain for the well pit lid. And he sat up 2 nights in the kitchen with the lights off, and nothing happened. Nothing ever happened again. That's the truth. Not that spring, not that summer, not in the 2 more years we lived there. The pump never ran wrong again one time. We moved down off the ridge in 2001 when Danny got on with a company in Mount Airy and quit running long haul. We sold the place to a couple from Florida who wanted a summer house, and I never told them, and I have carried that. Here's what I can't put down. That night wasn't the first night. The ground told me that. You don't churn 6 feet of clay into a hog wallow in one visit. That spigot had been getting used for months, which means that all through the fall of 1998 and January of 1999, on nights when the ground was soft, that pump had been kicking on under my kitchen at 2 and 3 and 4 in the morning while I lay upstairs asleep, and I had slept right through it, the way you sleep through a furnace. I slept through it. 4 nights a week, alone in that house with an infant, and somebody stood 8 feet from my kitchen wall in the dark and filled their jugs and walked back across my pasture to the woods, and I was asleep. And they never came in. That's the last piece, and it's the one that gets me at 2 in the morning even now, 26 years later in a house on a street with neighbors. They never once tried a door. They never came up on the porch. They never looked in a window that I know of. Whoever was living back in that timber below Chance's Creek needed water, and my spigot was the closest water there was. And they came and took it and went, all winter, and left everything else alone. They knew exactly who was in that house. They knew there was a woman and a baby, and no man 4 nights a week. Because you can't stand in a yard that many times and not know, and they never came in. I have spent my whole adult life trying to decide whether that means they were decent people, or whether it means they were waiting on something, and there is nobody left to ask. I moved into that house in August of 2013. The summer I turned 34, 6 weeks after my marriage ended in Bristol, and I needed a place I could afford by myself. It was on the edge of Marion, Virginia, the last house on a dead-end street where the town gives out and the ground starts going up toward Walker Mountain, with a hayfield on one side and a stand of locust and briars on the other. And above all of it, that long dark wall of ridge that puts you in shadow by 4 in the afternoon in November. $450 a month. 2 stories, white clapboard, built somewhere around 1910. With a porch across the front and a walnut tree in the yard, and a coal chute in the foundation that had been bricked shut. I signed with a woman named Rhonda from a management company on Main Street who handled it for the estate. That's the phrase she used, the estate. And I asked what she meant, and she said the owner had passed and it was tied up in family business, and they were just renting it in the meantime. She said the man's name once and I forgot it, and if I could go back and change one thing about that year, it would be that he died in 2011. 2 years empty, and then me. I was working second shift at a plant out past the interstate, 3:30 to midnight, and with cleanup and the drive, I'd get home somewhere between 12:20 and 12:40 every night, Monday through Friday. So my life that fall was a particular shape. I woke at 10, I did whatever a person does alone in a big empty house until 3. I worked. I came home to that dead-end street in the dark with the mountains standing over it, and nothing but my own porch light on for 200 yards in any direction. I want to say clearly that I liked it at first. After the year I'd had, the quiet was a mercy. The attic hatch was in the ceiling of the upstairs hall, a plywood panel in a frame, and up in that attic there was a single pull-chain porcelain fixture on a rafter, except somebody, decades back, had run a wire down the wall and put a toggle switch in the hall so you could turn it on before you went up. The pull chain still worked too. Either one would do it. The only way to know it was on was that the seams around the hatch would show a thin line of yellow light, and at night in a dark hallway you could see it plain. The first time was the 6th or 7th of November. I came in at 12:30, hung my coat on the newel post, went up the stairs, and the hall ceiling had a bright rectangle outlined in it. I stood there and looked at it for a while. And then I flipped the switch on the wall and it went out, and I went to bed. It never crossed my mind to be scared. I figured I'd bumped it that morning with a laundry basket. It's the kind of switch that's stiff and you'd know if you hit it. But that's not what a person thinks at midnight after a 9-hour shift. 2 nights later, it was on again. Then the thing started that turned it from a nuisance into something else, which is that it started being on in the morning. I'd flip it off at 12:30, sleep, and come out of my bedroom at 10 in the morning, and there'd be that seam of light in the ceiling, and the hall so bright it didn't show as much in daylight, but it was there. I did the sensible things. I want that on the record because for a long time afterward I punished myself for not doing more, and the truth is I did everything a reasonable man does. I took the switch plate off and looked at the wiring, which was old cloth insulated stuff spliced to newer Romex, and I thought maybe there's a short in it. Maybe there's an arc somewhere making contact when the house cools at night. I unscrewed the bulb in the attic fixture and left it out for 4 days, and nothing happened, and I put it back. I marked the switch with a piece of blue painter's tape so I'd know for certain which way was off. And it kept happening, tape and all. And finally, in the first week of December, I paid a man named Wells $40 to come out and look at it. He was there an hour. He pulled the fixture, he checked the run, he put a meter on it, and he came down the ladder wiping his hands and said the circuit was fine. Then he said something I didn't like and have never forgotten. He said, "It's a good switch. That's a heavy old toggle. It ain't gonna throw itself." I said, "Well, something's throwing it." He said, "Yeah," and he took my $40 and left. There were other things that fall, and I put every one of them somewhere ordinary. The upstairs hall was cold, not drafty, cold, 10 degrees colder than the rooms on either side of it, which I decided was the attic hatch, not ceiling. My smoke detector at the top of the stairs chirped for a new battery for 2 weeks, and then one day it didn't, and I never changed it, and I told myself the cold had brought it back. And I found the walnut tree out front had been climbed. Bark scuffed off the low fork, fresh, and figured it was boys from the neighborhood, though there weren't boys on that street. And the closest house with children in it was 6/10 of a mile. The thing that finally broke it open was the water stain. There'd been a stain on my bedroom ceiling since the day I moved in, over the foot of my bed. I about the size of a dinner plate, tea-colored with a dark ring around the edge. An old roof leak from long before my time, dried out and gone brown. I looked at it every night of my life for 4 months. It was one of those things your eye lands on when you're lying awake. And in the middle of December, I was lying there at 1 in the morning, staring up the way you do, and something in me went cold and would not settle. And it took me a solid 20 minutes to understand what I was looking at. It had changed shape, not spread. That's the thing. A leak that's active spreads. It gets bigger, it develops new rings, and there's a fresh dark center. This was the same size, and it was the same faded brown, but the shape of it was different. It had been narrow at one end with a hook to it like a comma, and now it was rounder, with a notch on the side that hadn't been there. The edges were the same age. The color was the same age. Only the outline had moved. There is exactly one way for the outline of an old dried stain on drywall to change. Something above it, sitting on top of that drywall, insulation, packed down against the stained area for decades, holding the moisture pattern, had been picked up and put back different. I didn't sleep that night. I lay under that ceiling with the light on until it got gray outside, and at some point I moved into the spare room downstairs and slept on the floor, and I did not go up in the attic for 4 days because I was working. And because I knew, and because I wanted 4 more days of not knowing. I went up on a Sunday, the 22nd of December, at 11 in the morning with the sun out, which is the only way I could make myself do it. I had a mag light and a hammer in my belt loop, and I stood on a step stool and pushed that hatch panel up and slid it sideways, and I got my head and shoulders through. The attic was empty. That's the first thing I saw, and for about 3 seconds it was the biggest relief of my life. Just an attic. The underside of the roof boards with daylight coming through a couple of nail holes, the rafters. I'd blown in insulation between the joists gone gray with age, the brick of the old chimney coming up through the middle, and cobwebs and dust on everything. And then my eyes adjusted, and I saw the dust. Attic dust is even. It's decades of fine gray powder that settles on top of insulation and on the flat tops of the joists, and it lies there undisturbed, and it is uniform across the whole space. Ours was that way in 3 directions. But going away from the hatch toward the far gable at the south end of the house, there was a path about 20 inches wide, wiped clean. Not footprints, a swept, continuous track where the dust had been scoured off the tops of 2 parallel joists, and the insulation between them had been pressed down flat, running the whole length of that attic in a straight line, 30-some feet, from the hatch to the gable end. The kind of track a body makes crawling on hands and knees, over and over. For a long time, I got up in there. I don't know why I did that either, except that I was 34, and something in me refused to go down that ladder not knowing. I followed it. The clean track passed right by the chimney and kept on, and about 2/3 of the way down, over where my bedroom was. I had stopped. The insulation there had been pulled up. Not scattered, lifted in one piece, the way you'd peel back a blanket, and folded over on itself against the next joist. Leaving a rectangle of bare drywall exposed between the framing, maybe 6 feet long and 16 inches wide. The exposed drywall was clean where a body had lain on it. There was the dark oval of a head at one end, worn into the paper. There was a place where the paper had gone shiny, and I could see the water stain from above. The brown of it soaked all the way through, dead center in that rectangle. There was nothing else up there. No bag, no bottle, no bedding, no trash. Whoever it was hadn't left one single object behind, and that's the part that I have never gotten past, because a squatter leaves things. A squatter has a nest. This was somebody who came, and lay down and left, and took everything with them every time, on a swept track worn into a 100-year-old floor. At the gable end, the vent louver had been unscrewed from the inside. 4 screws out, and the louver frame sitting loose in its opening, and beyond it a straight drop to the roof of the back porch. I called the sheriff's office, and a deputy came out that afternoon. He went up. He was up there 12 or 13 minutes, and when he came down, his face was different from when he went up. He said it looked like somebody had been getting in through that gable vent off the porch roof. And he said there'd been a lot of empty houses in that county the last few years, and people did all kinds of things. He asked if anything had been taken, and I said no, nothing. Not one thing in 4 months. He wrote a report. He told me to put a hasp and a padlock on that hatch and screw the louver back on with deck screws. And he suggested a motion light on the porch roof. And then he stood in my hall a second and said, "You keep this door locked?" And I said, "Yes, always." And he said, "Then he ain't coming in that way," and left. That's what stopped me sleeping. Because the vent explained the attic, but it never explained the switch. The toggle for that light was in the hall, on the wall, downstairs side of the hatch, on my side of the ceiling, not up in the attic. To flip it, you had to be standing in the second floor hallway of my house, 8 feet from my bedroom door, with your hand on the wall. Somebody could get up in the attic through that gable vent every night of the year and never once touch that switch. And the switch got thrown 15 or 20 times between November and Christmas. Some nights while I was at work, and some nights while I was asleep in a bed with 3/4 of an inch of drywall between me and where they lay. I moved out the first week of January, broke the lease and lost the deposit, and Rhonda didn't even argue about it, and I've thought about that too. Before I left, I asked her the owner's name again. He died in November of 2011. 71 years old, and he'd lived in that house alone for 30-some years. And Rhonda said the family were all out of state, and the will had been a mess, and the keys had been all over the place. That was her phrase before the management company took it on. She didn't know how many were out there. She said probably 4 or 5. She said it like it was nothing. Like everybody's house has 4 or 5 keys unaccounted for. I've lived in 3 places since, and I have never rented anything with an attic hatch inside the living space. My wife now, I remarried in 2018, thinks it's a preference about ceilings and storage, and I let her think it. And I still can't put it together right. Because a man who wants to rob you takes something, and a man who wants to hurt you has 100 chances at a sleeping man in an empty house at the end of a dead-end street. He never took anything. He never came in a room I was in that I know of. He lay down on the joists over my bed, on the same 6 feet of bare drywall, night after night, close enough to hear me breathe. And then he'd get up, and crawl back down that swept track and on his way out. Every single time, he'd reach out in the dark and turn on the light. I've never been able to decide if he was leaving it on so I'd know. Or if it was just what he'd done in that house every night for 30 years. And his hand still did it without asking him.